He sat hunched over a cluttered desk in a cramped room, the overhead bulb casting a tired, yellowish glare on folders filled with sketches and mechanical notes. The engineer's fingers, cracked and ink-stained, trembled as he sorted through a stack of unpaid bills, each one a silent accusation. Around him, the walls bore the weight of years, faded wallpaper, stubborn stains, and a clock that ticked with the sharpness of hunger. His wife moved quietly in the kitchen, steeling herself to stretch the last soup bone a little further. Their son pressed the holes in his socks together with his fingers, pretending not to notice as cold crept beneath the door. Yet few people in the city, let alone the world, knew his name. Outside, banners and parades celebrated generals with polished medals, soldiers with stirring speeches. Their sacrifices were felt publicly, measured in ovations and headlines, while he contributed in silence, a presence stitched into the tapestry but never seen. Day after day, he brought technical prowess, creative solutions, and a stubborn hope to his table, and yet the world thanked him only with obscurity and a wage that could hardly be stretched from one end of the month to the other. On certain nights, as distant thunder echoed with the dread of war, he would stare out the tiny kitchen window, asking himself how brilliance could coexist with such struggle. He had solved problems no one else would touch, fixing machines that refused to work, improving designs at a fraction of the cost, keeping entire operations functioning. Still, his worth remained invisible, intangible, always less than enough. His colleagues noticed sometimes, the ones who worked beside him gathering around the gray metal table in the drafty workshop. "You're the only one who can do this," they'd murmur, eyes darting from blueprints to the dust-speckled light. "Without you, nothing moves." Yet admiration never seemed to translate into material change. When paychecks arrived, he watched others paid for their uniforms, their rank, their bravado. His envelope was thinner, the numbers printed in faint ink, almost mocking him. Shame crept up with each polite refusal to invite friends home, each careful explanation to his hopeful child about why some things must wait. Deep in his chest, frustration built and twisted, threatening to choke creativity. Was it supposed to be this way? Could skill, dedication, and years of learning really matter so little when the world set prices on everything else? In moments of doubt, he almost believed that maybe he simply lacked something inborn, a talent for negotiation, a knack for visibility, a social current he could never swim. Yet when he looked at his hands, steady, clever, scarred with work, he felt an undeniable sense that his efforts deserved more. The war blurred the boundaries of each day, but something changed when desperation forced open new doors. The engineer found himself face to face with an impossible deadline. Mechanisms failed, resources were scarce, panic seeped through the corridors. Again, no one else stepped forward. This time, he crafted a design, elegant, shockingly simple, impossibly cheap. It worked beyond expectations. Leaders who'd never known his name suddenly circled his desk, eyes wide, voices tense and urgent. They replicated his solution everywhere. They hailed its genius at press conferences. Fortunes shifted, strategies changed, grand plans pivoted around his invisible contribution. The consequences were staggering. What he built moved armies, saved lives, shifted the balance of fate. And with that, the doors that had always been closed creaked open, just a little. For the first time, whispers of his value rippled outward. Yet beneath the attention, he faced new questions. Why did it take catastrophe for his work to be seen? Why was his livelihood always an afterthought, a line item trimmed for someone else's ambition? His story, both exceptional and all too common, echoes across decades and continents. Today it lives in countless homes and offices, people everywhere, quietly extraordinary yet stretched thin, talented yet unrecognized, pouring themselves into duties that never seem to pay their worth. Not because they are lacking in brilliance, or too shy, or incapable, but because somewhere along the way, the threads that connect skill to value became tangled and invisible. You know this story intimately, don't you? Perhaps your gift is written in code, carved in wood, sung in a quiet room, skillful, unique, and persistently uncaptured by the systems that award prestige or reward. Maybe you, too, have stared at the world and wondered how some turn effort into prosperity while others remain standing in the shadows. Tonight, As you look around your own life, the bills, the worn couch, the undramatic dailiness in which you carve new solutions from old problems, remember you are not alone. There's nothing wrong with your talent, your intellect, or your will. But the time has come to unravel the hidden patterns that shape your financial reality. This journey is about transformation, not just in what you do, but in how the world sees what you truly bring. Let's step forward and begin to discover the bridge between competence and abundance, between invisible contribution and celebrated prosperity. Long before dawn, fatigue haunted the eyes of the city's unknown builders, those who didn't wear banners or carry medals. In a modest apartment 2 blocks from the stagnant factory district, Amelia stood over spreadsheets at the cracked kitchen table while her husband, Tomas, coaxed warmth from the squeaky radiator. They shared a quiet resilience, built from years of treading economic tightropes, and, despite the chill that gnawed through the floor, an unspoken agreement kept them moving. If you cannot yet change the game, you can study it relentlessly from the sidelines. Tonight, Amelia's mind drifted to the winding roots of unspoken rules. Culture had always been a ghost at their dinner table, nudging her to clear away ambition in favor of gratitude for enough. As a child, she watched her parents cut coupons and frown at broken appliances, overheard comments about people who dared to want more. She never asked why abundance felt taboo, or how dreams were quietly measured against invisible ceilings. Instead, these silent codes burrowed into her beliefs, as surely as frost beneath the windowsill. The radio hummed advice about tight belts, about honoring hard work above all, while neighbors traded tales of those who reached for more and got burned. Over time, cautious hope hardened into a philosophy: play small, play safe, and, above all, don't ask for what you really want. Yet as Amelia leafed through expense columns and watched her son, Diego, doodle circuits and gears in the margins of homework he didn't especially enjoy, a question pressed inward: whose values had she inherited, and whose dreams did she suppress on autopilot? Now she traced these patterns with the meticulousness of an architect. The lines between prudence and self-limitation blurred. She replayed conversations from boardrooms where she translated expert ideas for leaders who only valued what glittered. So much of her perception of money was scripted long before she chose her career path. Each time she considered negotiating a raise, she stumbled over inner warnings, echoes of her mother's voice, stern and tired. Don't ask for too much, or they'll remember it. Outside, the city rumbled with kinetic energy and quiet aspiration. Anonymous commuters shuffled past billboards promising overnight success, but Amelia recognized the contradictions conditioned into collective consciousness. Walking to the market, she noticed how some folks wore wealth like armor, while others dressed competence in humility, rarely daring to set their sights higher. Entire neighborhoods acted as glass ceilings, delineating what people thought they deserved based on upbringing, tradition, or silent agreement. Returning to her lived reality, Amelia caught herself reenacting scripts from her upbringing even as she tried to coach Diego. Sitting with him as the heater whined, she told stories of ancestors who built entire lives on ingenuity alone, yet she often forgot to highlight how those innovations could have lifted the family further, beyond mere survival. One afternoon, Diego asked, "Why do some people make more for thinking and others for building?" The answer lodged beneath her ribs. She realized she'd always equated value with visibility, without questioning who had written those definitions. That evening, an unexpected insight arrived. Tomas confessed, "Sometimes, I wonder if I'm living out my father's fears instead of my own hopes." His quiet words became a mirror for everything Amelia had carried from the past, a complex patchwork of advice, anxieties, and instructions not designed for expansion, just endurance. Rather than fueling drive, these inherited beliefs served as invisible fences, neatly marking the territory in which she allowed herself to dream. Sunrise found Amelia watching steam curl above her coffee. Rather than letting self-doubt dictate her day, she scrawled a list of every lesson, opinion, and parental warning that had ever touched her concept of earning or deserving. For the first time, she considered interrogating those stories instead of absorbing them. She asked herself, who benefits when I unconsciously play by these old rules? What would it look like if I chose, deliberately, what to keep and what to outgrow? Day broke over the city, ordinary yet quietly revolutionary. Amelia, armed with a new lens, resolved to examine each inherited belief with scientific precision, testing it for truth, for relevance, for the freedom it could offer. Step by step, she imagined how tomorrow might unfold differently if she no longer surrendered to the old commentary echoing in the back of her mind. If she reauthored her story, she wondered, who else could she inspire to do the same? As the city's noise drifted up through an open window, Tomas sat at his workbench surrounded by blueprints and faded manuals, hands idly tracing the edge of a drafting compass. He narrowed his eyes, not at the challenge of the device before him, but at a deeper puzzle, one that lingered in the pit of his stomach, stubborn as hunger. In the years he'd toiled, he'd tangled repeatedly with judgments, snatched out of the air from supervisors' offhand remarks or the subtle shrug of colleagues who dismissed his proposals. "That's too ambitious, Tomas," they would say, almost with a smirk. "Keep to what's safe." There was no malice, just a joke passed along like a cold in winter, and yet each one lodged beneath his ribs, tricky as a fishbone. Tonight, what gnawed at him was less about their voices and more about the invisible boundaries those words erected around his wages and his worth. The notion that certain ideas, or people, could only rise so far sounded logical to those who'd never risked untested paths. Still, Tomas felt a searing frustration. After all, ambitious was the lifeblood of every device in the room. It was only in talk of money that daring ideas became a liability. He wondered, was it possible that what seemed like caution was actually a quietly destructive myth, one that tethered his competence to the lowest rung of expectation? Turning from the cluttered bench, Tomas caught the flicker of the TV in the next room. A news anchor cheerfully listed the explosive value of the latest military contracts. The numbers were dizzying. It struck him, not for the first time, that profit flourished in the hands of those who could recite their worth without apology, even when their expertise was dwarfed by his own. He stared at his calloused palms, then at the sketches others had called genius when pressure was on, but ignored when it came time for decisions about compensation. Furthermore, legend and fact often collided in his imagination. There was the tale of old Mr. Hensley at the factory, always present, always steady. Everyone said he was just the repair guy, yet his innovations kept several departments solvent through downturns. Still, Hensley retired quietly, plaque in hand, invisible on any list of major contributors. In contrast, recent hires with polished resumes frequently talked their way into higher salaries, weaving their stories with confident certainty. Tomas pondered the stark dissonance: skill admired, yet undervalued; bravado rewarded, substance overlooked. Why did the marketplace lift those who claimed value more loudly than those who quietly produced it? Consequently, Tomas found himself testing a new hypothesis, one he'd never dared articulate aloud. Maybe it wasn't technical talent or commitment that set the ceiling, but a web of myths about who should be paid, how much, and for what reason. The myth of noble sacrifice, for instance, cast discomfort as virtue, masking neglect with a veneer of integrity. If you're really passionate, you shouldn't care about the money, the line went. Yet, as days passed, that phrase stung like an insult. It rendered invisible both the necessity of security and the reality that abundance could empower more generosity, not less. Challenging that perspective, Tomas adopted a new ritual. Each morning, he wrote on a scrap of cardboard, "My work creates value beyond measure." He taped it to his lamp, where its scrawled letters caught the first sunlight, a quiet protest against all the stale axioms. He decided to approach conversations about compensation with a different mindset. When his supervisor suggested, "Let's hold off on raises until next quarter," Tomas replied, voice steady, "Can we revisit the value of these last two design innovations? Their impact is measurable, and I'd like to align my compensation with the results." Though his heart pounded, he felt something shift. The old myth, confronted directly, lost a little of its hold. As weeks unfurled, Tomas noticed a ripple effect. His children overheard the change in his voice and began to negotiate bedtime routines more assertively, convinced their contributions to the family rhythm mattered. Even at work, a young intern approached him for advice on being seen as more than a cog, and Tomas answered, not with old warnings, but with stories of asking, of demonstrating worth in visible ways. In this new climate, the myths that once governed Tomas's world retreated, exposed by illumination rather than brute force. He began to realize that the truest innovation wasn't always hardware or blueprints. It was the courage to question inherited limits and the wisdom to name your value with conviction. Where once he'd assumed only others could play that game, now he crafted his own rules, grounded in evidence, powered by a quiet belief in possibility. The boundaries of his story, once rigid, now felt like contours he could redraw. Dawn seeped through heavy curtains, painting soft stripes across the linoleum floor of Amelia's small kitchen as she pressed her palms to the cool surface of the table. Everything in the room spoke of careful choices. Chipped mugs stacked by color, coupons sorted into neat piles, a hand-me-down radio humming quietly with the day's first weather forecast. As Amelia spread butter on slices of bread, a different kind of hunger shadowed her, one that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with possibility. Without warning, a spark of inspiration nudged her mind. This morning, instead of calculating what was left to spend, she slid a blank notebook toward herself. The wide, empty page was both intimidating and full of promise. In a single breath, she committed to charting something new, not her debts or obligations, but tangible moments of value she'd created in her world. She began with what felt small, repairing her neighbor's broken heater in a bitter February, guiding Diego through a science fair that rebuilt his confidence, designing an updated process at work that saved dozens of hours each month, though few had noticed. As the list grew, so did a strange exhilaration. She realized that gratitude wasn't about pretending hardships didn't exist. It was about giving honest weight to what she accomplished, even if no one else named it. Her pen moved more quickly as she recognized another kind of wealth hiding in plain sight. Cultivating gratitude, it seemed, was not a distraction from the real work of change, but the first essential act in reshaping perception. It softened the rigid outlines of self-doubt, creating space for new narrative threads. To deepen this practice, Amelia started each morning with a ritual. 3 things she appreciated about her resourcefulness, written before the day's demands pressed in. At midday, reflecting on her mounting list, she felt compelled to take her awareness beyond reflection. Amelia turned to a fresh page and asked herself an honest question. What patterns, habits, not beliefs, continually reinforced her financial stagnation? She mapped her days with forensic precision, marking every moment she reflexively undercharged, deflected credit, or hesitated to send an invoice for freelance work completed. The web of behavior surprised her. Somewhere between good intentions and resigned shrugs, she saw how these habits quietly accumulated, eating away at her income as surely as any interest charge. Determined to disrupt these patterns, Amelia imagined small, manageable experiments. The next time a neighbor asked for help with electrical work, she would state her rate without apology, voice calm even if her heart threatened to hammer through her chest. Instead of defaulting to scarcity, she would visualize herself as someone who exchanged expertise for respect and fair compensation. A simple, internal film reel she played out during short walks. Each tiny gesture, she realized, was evidence. Over time, as these microactions layered themselves into her routine, the architecture of her day changed. She was no longer simply surviving, but quietly rewiring possibilities. Still, Amelia recognized that mindset alone would not put food on the table. To bridge the inner and outer worlds, she tested a new habit, completing a daily after-action review, noting real outcomes linked to her shift in thinking. Did she follow through on stating her value? Did she track and thank herself for decisive, courageous choices? The ledger became part journal, part scorecard, vivid with incremental wins, each a brick laid in the foundation of actual abundance. Later that week, as she sipped tea by a window streaked with rain, Diego returned from school with a crumpled dollar bill and wide eyes. He'd traded a homemade gadget for his first earnings. It wasn't much, but I asked this time, he said, sheepish but proud. Amelia felt her throat tighten, not from worry, but from a swelling certainty. Each act of courage, however small, reverberated far beyond the kitchen walls. In that moment, Emilia understood that shifting her financial reality was not a one-time leap, but a daily, accumulative practice. The practical steps, gratitude, honest self-reflection, decisive action, were not just tasks to complete, but vital signals to herself and her family. You can choose your worth and manifest it, one conscious step at a time. As rain slid silver against the glass, she smiled, knowing the ritual would return tomorrow, its power growing with every new page. Late one evening, while the city's pulse slowed to a hush and the last streetcar rumbled past, Tomas lingered beside his daughter's doorway, hesitating before the threshold. Inside, little Nora sprawled across a mess of colored paper and wires, eyebrows furrowed in fierce concentration. A half-assembled lamp, her latest experiment, glowed uncertainly, casting wild, dancing shadows up the peeling wallpaper. She looked up, her voice uncertain but hopeful. "Will anyone care about this?" she asked, holding her breath for his answer, her small hands marked with graphite smudges and ambition. Rather than placating her with easy reassurance, Tomas sat down and let the question rest between them. His gaze moved from her work to the stubborn crack in the ceiling above, memories buzzing back. Early moments when he'd chased excellence for its own sake, only to find that passion rarely translated to external recognition on its own. "You know," he began, picking his words as carefully as circuitry, "great ideas are powerful, but without connecting them to people who need them, they can stay locked up, invisible, gathering dust." His words hung in the quiet, setting the tone for a conversation neither of them had been ready for until now. Subtle shifts in positioning, Tomas learned, created ripples that redefined how work was experienced and rewarded. Instead of waiting for approval or discovery, he challenged Nora to consider whose problems her lamp might solve. Picture someone reading at night when their overhead light is too harsh, maybe a writer, or someone our neighbor knows. Now, how would you show them this solves exactly that? A flicker of insight sparked in her eyes as she realized illumination could be more than a hobby. It could be a solution in the real world. This, he gently pressed, was the difference between talent and perceived value. Talent alone may dazzle, but value emerges when you connect your gifts to someone else's lived need, making the hidden visible. Elsewhere, Tomas's own journey evolved similarly. He'd begun to notice how those at the top of his organization didn't just possess skill, they owned the narrative of their contributions. One afternoon, as rain tapped softly against factory glass, he scheduled a meeting with his supervisor. No longer content to be known as the guy who makes things work, he mapped out each process he'd streamlined, paired his technical feats with operational savings, and projected future results based on data. But the real shift occurred when he painted a vivid story, how his redesign allowed a critical part to be shipped 2 weeks faster, averting a costly production freeze. By framing his impact as essential to the company's survival, Tomas recast his work from background maintenance to strategic necessity. The atmosphere in the room changed perceptibly. His supervisor leaned forward, newly attentive. A pivotal realization crystallized. Transitioning from invisible asset to indispensable contributor required not just mastery, but deliberate storytelling. A translation job as vital as any technical specification. Tomas guided Nora to draft a short note to local businesses, describing not just what her lamp did, but how it could make an evening softer, a workspace friendlier. She beamed as the first neighbor replied, eager to buy one for their study. The boundaries of compensation began to blur. The child's creative spark, now matched with genuine utility, blossomed into a new stream of possibility. Integral to this theme, Tomas discovered the importance of advocacy, both for oneself and others. He began quietly championing a soft-spoken teammate's automation solution at internal meetings, drawing connections between the engineering fix and the broader company goals. As others grew more vocal, the environment started to change. The room filled with questions, gratitude, and, most surprisingly, budget allocations. Tomas felt pride not only for his own gains, but for helping build a culture where technical talent and economic value finally stood on common ground. Day by day, in kitchens, workshops, and bedrooms filled with low-watt bulbs and high-watt dreams, the family story unfolded anew. Each member, empowered to connect what they loved with what the world needed, watched the tide of recognition and reward rise, slow and steadfast as dawn. The end of the week arrived in a hush, pale sunlight flickering between the gaps in the workshop window. As the clock struck 7, Tomas reached for the worn canvas bag that sat beneath his workstation, the one he rarely used unless necessity outweighed caution. He glanced at the untouched meal his wife had left hours before, hunger replaced by a restlessness he couldn't quite shake. On his way out, he paused in the hall mirror and studied his own reflection, searching for any sign of the new self he'd glimpsed in conversations past, the version with untested power just below the surface. Downstairs, the old elevator whined as it descended to the street. The building's caretaker, Mrs. Abrams, called after him with worry etched into her brow. "Burning the candle at both ends?" she asked, voice gentle. Tomas offered a thin smile, unsure how to explain the whirlwind of momentum building behind his eyes. "Sometimes you have to light a new wick," he muttered, the phrase foreign but true as he stepped out into the biting evening. As he walked the city blocks, Tomas couldn't escape the pulse of urgency swelling within. It wasn't ambition in the traditional sense. It was the quickening that arrives when old stories start to shed, when an unpracticed identity waits just behind the curtain of fear. The tension tugged at his shoulders as he neared a small cafe, its windows fogged and golden at the edges. Inside, a modest networking event was underway, and for once, his voice didn't falter as he introduced himself not as a worker, but as an innovator seeking partnership. The shift in words, though subtle, sent a tremor down his spine. His hands trembled only slightly as he outlined a vision for a product that could streamline energy use for entire neighborhoods. Around him, strangers listened. Some nodded, a few offered contacts or encouragement. Further into the night, he found himself engaged in a debate with an entrepreneur who challenged his pricing model. Rather than shrinking back, Tomas leaned in with unexpected authority and reframed his value, citing industry data, speaking with clarity gleaned from years of obscurity. The entrepreneur paused before conceding. "You sound like you've steered teams for years." Tomas nodded, a grin teasing his lips as he realized the words weren't just a performance. They anchored a new reality. Each interaction reinforced an emerging self-image, not merely as someone with clever ideas, but as a person whose presence altered the equation in every room he entered. Meanwhile, back home, his wife, Emilia, carried out a quiet transformation of her own. She sat at the kitchen table, scattered receipts and project outlines before her, wrestling down the familiar anxiety that surfaced any time extra money or opportunity approached. This time, instead of spiraling into old patterns, she asked herself a daring question. What if my household needs are not a burden, but a proof of my capacity to provide? The weight began to lift, piece by piece. Convinced that prosperity need not threaten her integrity, Emilia researched ways to advocate for herself at an upcoming staff review. She practiced her pitch aloud, rewriting it until the language fit her like a new coat, expressing her impact not with apology, but certitude and pride. Soon after, this shift began rippling through her relationships as well. Her son, observing his mother's resolve, returned home one evening with a brilliant, if chaotic, prototype for a community garden irrigation system. "Would anyone want this?" he asked. Instead of rushing to temper his expectations, Emilia challenged him to approach the local neighborhood council and describe the project as an answer to their summertime struggles. That small act, the willingness to frame creative labor as essential, sparked a cascade of invitations and offers for both mother and son to present solutions at future meetings. The air in the household changed, charged with the realization that claiming a prosperous identity wasn't a single moment, but a looping spiral of affirmation, action, negotiation, and reflection. Each member of the family, in their own way, began to inhabit a roomier version of themselves, one that made space for both humility and healthy self-regard. Shadows of unworthiness still hovered at times, but now, a sturdier core had been built. The family no longer looked at scarcity as a sign of moral goodness, nor did they hide their growing ambitions from one another. Instead, they moved through each day as people entrusted, and entrusting, themselves with greater possibility. In a city teeming with faces both recognized and forgotten, they no longer saw themselves as background scenery. They became, in quiet ways, the story's main characters, drafting a narrative where prosperity was both a responsibility and a right, as natural and vital as the sunrise waiting on the horizon. Reflecting on this journey so far, it feels almost as if the city itself breathes with new potential, as if its streets, so long walked in quiet perseverance, are now lined with doorways lit by possibility. In the softly humming hours before sunrise, there's a momentary hush when the old stubborn narratives seem to loosen their grip, making room for subtler notes of confidence to thread their way through the fabric of daily life. The air holds an electricity, as if those countless acts of silent diligence, each unseen adjustment, every brave ask, have accumulated unseen momentum, quietly shifting not just circumstances but the ground beneath your feet. In homes scattered through crowded blocks, around dimly lit tables, or in the gentle warmth of home offices, the invisible work of transformation stirs beneath the surface. You might notice the tiniest alteration, a new steadiness in the way someone answers the phone, an almost imperceptible recalibration in family conversations, an exchange at the grocery counter, a pause before responding to a colleague. Each becomes an inflection point, echoing with decisions made at a deeper level. The outer world might appear unchanged, but beneath the ordinary rituals, there simmers a convergence of intention and emerging self-regard. Picture this process as a landscape waking from winter. The earliest green shoots press through packed earth, undramatic but relentless, their progress wrought by a patient chemistry, warmth steadily applied, roots daring downward before the world sees one blade. There is no singular event, no blaring declaration, only the persistent accumulation of choices, modest, daily, sometimes faltering, which ultimately remake the terrain. So too, the architecture of identity and value takes new shape within you, invisible at first, but building quietly toward a threshold soon to be crossed. There are moments now when the past shadow seems lighter, its lessons woven not as unfinished business, but as threads in an ever-complicating tapestry of existence. Worry and hope, disappointment and ambition, each comes forward for re-examination, not as separate adversaries, but as interlocked energies. The pulse of old hesitation begins to synchronize with a quieter conviction, like a symphony finding resonance from disparate notes. It is in this place, where the old boundaries grow soft and the scaffolding of belief is still tender, that anticipation for what's possible becomes tangible. You might sense, too, that the world around you starts to respond in kind. Encounters feel weightier, as though others notice the subtle change in body language, the newfound clarity in your presence. Doors that once seemed wedged shut now wait for a knock that feels inevitable. Relationships recalibrate. Even silence feels different, more contemplative, pregnant with expectation rather than resignation. This is the sound of life rearranging itself around your new posture. Across the days and weeks, vision sharpens, seeing value not as a finite reward, but as something woven into the marrow of creation itself. There's a growing internal certainty that the worth you bring has always been enough, always been vital, long before it was named, before it was measured. Now, as the light expands and the horizon steadies, you stand at the edge of something both startling and familiar. The convergence of countless internal revolutions, the slow ignition of conviction, the many subtle permissions you've finally granted yourself, all move you toward the cusp of a larger unfolding, where the next voice you're waiting to hear might just be your own. In these in-between hours, the pace of change feels at once glacial and seismic. You may feel poised on the threshold of a new narrative, the old script still visible in the rear view, the next chapter quietly gathering force at your feet. The atmosphere is one of readiness, not rest. Each inhalation carries a question more pressing with each breath. What becomes possible now, when you choose, fully, consciously, to step forward and author the story that has been waiting for you all along? As midnight puddled quietly in the corners of the apartment, a gentle hush fell over the building. From outside, the city pressed on, its distant lights flickering as steady as heartbeat lines on some collective, unseen monitor. Tomas leaned against the kitchen doorframe, watching Amelia as she folded the week's family budget into a stack of overdue letters. She caught his gaze, a silent question rising between them. Not one of how much or how soon, but a deeper wondering. Maybe it was always meant to be asked in the stillness. What, truly, is the measure of a life? There was a time they might have answered with only numbers, wages, debt balances, meager savings. But tonight, their story felt different. The kitchen's worn surfaces, its stubby pencil nubs, the handwritten affirmations taped beside the chipped clock, seemed imbued with a new kind of gravity. Every tough conversation, every act of courage or self-advocacy, every tiny spark of resourcefulness, had built something between these walls that no external force could reduce. This quiet accumulation, woven from so many ordinary moments, had become its own currency, the kind not counted in a bank ledger, but felt in the gentle confidence that now lingered even after the harshest day. Their children slept nearby, the soft rise and fall of small breaths a lullaby threaded through the dark. Amelia pressed her palm to the table, feeling its steadiness travel up her arm and settle inside. She understood now, as Tomas did, that abundance isn't a finish line awaiting the chosen, but an unfolding, cumulative rhythm that each of them had learned to dance, sometimes awkward, sometimes graceful, but always moving forward. In their home, prosperity had begun to lose its skin-deep sheen and reveal itself as something more intimate. The dignity of being seen, the freedom to claim space without apology, the courageous insistence that their talent and labor mattered. Outside, a night wind stirred, carrying the distant echo of a city never fully at rest. Here, within these four walls, an inheritance was quietly being rewritten. The old scripts of undeserving and invisibility had loosened. In their place stood new mantras, statements of belonging and worth that would guide not only their own choices, but their children's, and perhaps, rippling outward, those of neighbors struggling under the same silent burdens. Tomorrow still glittered with uncertainty, but for the first time, it felt more invitation than threat, a door opening onto terrain they'd begun, finally, to chart for themselves. With the lamp dimmed low and the quiet punctuated only by the refrigerator's hum, Tomas reached out, covering Amelia's hand with his own. "Whatever comes, we know how to find our way now," he whispered, not as a promise carved in stone, but as a living truth, earned and cherished. In that simple, honest closeness, the magnitude of internal change revealed itself. They were no longer merely survivors of circumstance, but quiet architects of value, unafraid to articulate their worth, to negotiate for light, to redesign what enough could mean. As morning edged its first cool rays across the city, something shifted. Light crept into places that had felt locked and stagnant, and the world, in all its complexity, seemed suddenly open to the possibility that perhaps the grandest transformations are not golden, blaring, or celebrated in stadiums, but quietly built. One aligned decision, one brave conversation, one silent vow, right at home, in the heart's own everyday revolution. Theirs was a story rewritten, and, if you're listening closely, it could be yours, too.